Two empires, two geniuses. A war that will shape the fate of history. Hannibal, the man who challenged Rome at its heart. Scipio Aemilianus, the man who brought revenge to Rome. This is the story of Hannibal and Scipio, and the war that shaped the world. The Mediterranean, blue and endless, has always been more than just water. It was the stage of empires, the cradle of ambition, the sea where destinies collided. In the 3rd century BCE, a fire began to burn. From the proud city of Carthage, it leapt across the waves to challenge Rome itself. And Rome, stubborn and unyielding, responded in kind. This was not a single war, but a struggle that spanned generations, passed down like an inherited curse. At its heart stood two men, born decades apart, never to face each other in life, yet bound by an eternal rivalry. The first, Hannibal Barca, a child who swore before the gods eternal hatred for Rome, a commander whose daring led elephants across the frozen Alps, whose brilliance at Cannae carved his name into the nightmares of every Roman citizen. The second, Scipio Aemilianus, a Roman of destiny, heir to a legacy forged in blood, who rose not to meet Hannibal in battle, but to finish the war he had begun. Patient, relentless, he laid siege to Carthage until nothing remained but smoke and silence. Two men, two visions of war, one unending conflict that reshaped the ancient world. And so we must ask, what truly connects these two military prodigies? One who terrorized Rome, and one who buried Carthage in ashes. He was born into fire. Hannibal Barca, son of the great Hamilcar, did not inherit a peaceful world, but one seared by the bitterness of defeat. Carthage had been humbled in the First Punic War, stripped of Sicily, and forced to bow under Roman terms. In this crucible, a boy was brought to the altar, and before the gods he swore an oath of undying enmity toward Rome. It was not just a child's vow, it became the very marrow of his being. As a young man, Hannibal was not content to guard Carthage's fragile empire. He sought to strike at its greatest rival in the boldest way imaginable. The conventional wisdom of the age dictated patience, attrition, and the slow grind of war. Hannibal rejected this. His vision was audacious. He would carry the fight directly into Italy, tearing the heart from the Roman Republic itself. The march that followed is still spoken of with awe. In 218 BCE, Hannibal led his polyglot army across the treacherous Alps. Snow and hunger claimed thousands, yet what emerged on the other side was more than an army. It was a living symbol of defiance. War elephants, the beasts of Africa, now trampled the Italian soil. Rome, for the first time, faced not an external menace, but an invader standing on its own land. Hannibal's genius lay not in overwhelming numbers. He rarely possessed them, but in his uncanny ability to turn terrain, timing, and psychology into weapons. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, he sprung a massive ambush, annihilating a Roman army in the fog. Yet his masterpiece came a year later, on the flat fields of Cannae. Facing a force nearly double his own, Hannibal executed a double envelopment so precise, so devastating that it has been studied by generals for over 2 millennia. The Roman army, 50,000 strong, was encircled, compressed, and destroyed. It was not merely a victory, it was a slaughter. For Rome, Cannae became synonymous with catastrophe, and yet, in this triumph lay the seeds of limitation. Hannibal's brilliance could terrify and destroy, but it could not summon reinforcements from a hesitant Carthage. His soldiers bled for him, his strategy rattled the world, but he was ultimately a commander fighting not only Rome, but also the indifference of his own homeland. Rome, bruised and battered, learned, adapted, and endured. Still, Hannibal endures as more than a general. He is a myth, a symbol of audacity against impossible odds. He made Rome tremble, brought the Republic to its knees, and forced it to reinvent itself in order to survive. To the Romans, he was not simply a man. He was the shadow that haunted their collective memory, the embodiment of a nightmare that might return. Hannibal Barca was not just a warrior of his time. He was a force of nature, a storm that swept across Italy, whose echoes shaped the very destiny of Rome itself. Questions for comments. Do you believe Hannibal could have defeated Rome if Carthage had fully supported him with men and resources? Is Hannibal the greatest battlefield tactician in history, or was he simply a tragic genius doomed by politics? If Hannibal embodied the storm that nearly shattered Rome, then Scipio Aemilianus was the cold wind that extinguished Carthage forever. Born in 185 BCE, he was the grandson by blood of Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the victor at Pydna against Macedon, and the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who had once defeated Hannibal at Zama. Few Roman youths carried such a burden of expectation, yet Aemilianus was not shaped merely by lineage. He was forged by a republic that had survived its darkest hour and emerged stronger, more disciplined, and more relentless. Rome had learned from its brush with annihilation. From his earliest days in politics and the army, Scipio stood out. He was austere, disciplined, and deeply reflective. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he cultivated the favor of philosophers and Greek intellectuals, seeking not only to master the art of war, but also the wisdom of governance. He moved with an air of inevitability, as though history itself had chosen him. When Rome turned its gaze once more upon Carthage in the Third Punic War, Scipio rose to meet the challenge. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage was no longer the empire of Hannibal. It was a humbled city, shackled by Roman treaties, yet still feared for its resilience. The Roman Senate, driven by men like Cato the Elder, who ended every speech with "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed, was determined to erase their rival once and for all. The task, however, was anything but simple. The walls of Carthage were massive, her people desperate, and her defenders fierce. Rome sent generals to break the city, but they faltered against the sheer will of Carthaginian resistance. It was then that Scipio Aemilianus was entrusted with command, and where his genius revealed itself. Unlike Hannibal, Scipio did not gamble on spectacular battles or audacious maneuvers. He embodied patience. He tightened the noose around Carthage, building trenches, walls, and naval blockades. He turned the city into a prison, cutting off food and supplies. His strategy was not one of swift annihilation, but of inevitable suffocation. For 3 years, he ground down the Carthaginian resistance with unyielding pressure, stripping away hope until the once proud city stood at the edge of ruin. In 146 BCE, the final storm broke. Roman soldiers poured into Carthage street by street, house by house. The fighting was savage, desperate, and unrelenting. For 6 days, the city burned. Temples were sacked, citizens were slaughtered or enslaved, and the memory of Carthage was reduced to rubble and ash. Standing amid the smoking ruins, Scipio wept. He quoted Homer, reflecting that every great city, Troy, Carthage, and one day Rome itself, would meet the same fate. Scipio Aemilianus was not remembered as a daring battlefield prodigy like his adoptive grandfather or Hannibal. He was remembered as the executor of history's grim decree, a man who wielded patience as his weapon, discipline as his armor, and inevitability as his legacy. In him, the Punic Wars found their final chapter. The eternal duel between Rome and Carthage ended not with Hannibal's triumph, but with Scipio Aemilianus's cold efficiency. He became the man who sealed Carthage's fate, not through brilliance of a single battle, but through the relentless march of Rome's will. In Scipio's shadow, Carthage ceased to exist, not merely as a rival, but as an idea. Questions for comments. Do you see Scipio Aemilianus as a brilliant strategist in his own right, or simply the instrument of Rome's overwhelming power? If you had lived in 146 BCE, would you have viewed the destruction of Carthage as justice or as tragedy? Hannibal Barca and Scipio Aemilianus were men shaped not only by their times, but also by the different lessons they drew from Rome's century-long struggle with Carthage. Both were geniuses of war, but they operated with entirely opposite philosophies. For Hannibal, war was about daring, speed, and the manipulation of human psychology. He thrived on risk, reading the mind of his opponent as if it were another battlefield. At Trebia, he lured the Romans into freezing waters, exploiting their hunger and fatigue. At Lake Trasimene, he staged one of history's most famous ambushes, turning the natural landscape into a trap. And at Cannae, his masterpiece, Hannibal used a seemingly vulnerable center to crush the largest Roman army ever assembled up to that time. His philosophy was simple. Wars are not won by numbers, but by breaking the will and cohesion of the enemy. Yet this brilliance came with its limitations. Hannibal's victories depended on opportunity, surprise, and the courage of his troops, who were far from home and lacked constant reinforcements. His strategic vision ended at Rome's gates. He could shatter armies, but without the manpower and resources to siege the city, his brilliance remained tactical rather than absolute. Hannibal embodied the archetype of the daring commander, a man who could achieve the impossible but struggled to consolidate his triumphs into permanent outcomes. Scipio Aemilianus, by contrast, represented the maturation of Roman warfare. He had no illusions about lightning victories or the sudden destruction of an enemy army. Instead, his focus was attrition, patience, and systemic destruction. During the Third Punic War, he transformed Carthage's defense into a slow death sentence. His tactics were not spectacular like Cannae, they were relentless. He cut off supplies, tightened the blockade, and bled the Carthaginians until their city collapsed under starvation and despair. Aemilianus embodied Rome's cold calculation, the belief that no matter how many years it took, Rome's discipline, organization, and resources would grind its enemies to dust. He was not chasing glory in a single battlefield gamble. He sought security in inevitable destruction. His leadership style reflected the very ethos of Rome itself, pragmatic, collective, and merciless when needed. Thus, in comparing the two, Hannibal represents the dazzling brilliance of tactical genius, the lightning strike that terrifies and inspires. Scipio Aemilianus represents the crushing inevitability of strategic patience, the slow tightening of a noose that an enemy cannot escape. One aimed to shock the world in moments of brilliance. The other ensured that no resistance could survive long enough to threaten Rome again. And in their legacies, we find two archetypes of command: the daring risk-taker versus the calculating strategist. Hannibal remains immortal for his victories, even in defeat. Scipio Aemilianus is remembered less for a single battle and more for ending a war, forever altering the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Do you think bold, tactical brilliance like Hannibal's can outweigh the long-term power of strategic patience? If you were a commander, would you prefer Hannibal's daring risks or Scipio Aemilianus's relentless certainty?